The key was still in the lock, which told Eleanor Pierce the sheriff hadn't left on purpose. She stood on the boardwalk outside the Logan Creek Sheriff's office, her calfskin suitcase resting at her ankles, and tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Autumn wind carried the smell of wood smoke and dry leaves, but inside that window, nothing moved. Dust motes drifted through the afternoon light like tiny ships with no destination. In there, between the glass and the iron bars, someone's spider had spun a web so delicate it looked like lace stitched by a patient hand. 3 weeks early, the train hadn't meant to bring her here until November 9th, but a rail car had jumped the tracks near Hastings, and the conductor had made a decision. Passengers for the western route would transfer at Logan Creek, wait for repairs, and reboard when the line was clear. That was 8 hours ago. Eleanor had asked around. She'd learned that the sheriff of Logan Creek was a man named Caleb Boone, that he'd paid the agency fee in full, and that his letters, both of them, brief and polite, had promised to meet her at the November train. She hadn't told him she was coming early. Surprises, she'd thought, could be good things. A woman who arrives ahead of schedule shows she's eager, shows she's useful, shows she isn't afraid of hard work or empty roads, or the way the prairie seemed to swallow the sky whole at sunset. Now, looking through that dusty window, she wondered if she'd been wrong. The hitching post outside the office held no horse. The trough beneath it held no water, just a few inches of brown, scum-topped liquid that had probably been there since September. Man's boot had left a scuff mark on the boardwalk steps days ago, and no one had bothered to sweep it away. Eleanor picked up her suitcase and tried the door. It opened. The smell hit her first. Cold coffee, old paper, and something else. Something sharp and metallic that she told herself was just the rust on the iron stove. The office was small. A desk sat against the wall with papers stacked unevenly. A wanted poster on top depicting a man with a face like a closed fist, no chin to speak of, just a slope from lip to neck. Next to the poster sat a dented tin cup, and inside the cup, coffee had grown a thin grey skin. Beside the cup, face down, a sheriff's star rested on a leather-bound Bible. She set her suitcase down. The sound echoed. Hello? No answer, but she heard something. Breathing, wet and shallow. And coming from somewhere deeper in, the office had 3 cells in the back, iron bars, grey blankets, a single narrow window in the rear wall that let in a square of pale light. Cell was empty. The second, empty. The third. He was on his knees. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The man she knew it was him, even though she'd only seen a photograph, was gripping the bars with one hand. His forehead pressed against the cold iron, his body folded like a man in prayer. Shirt was dark across the shoulder. Too dark. And his hand, the one not holding the bars, was pressed hard against his ribs. The keyring hung on a hook beside the cells. Her fingers found it, shaking slightly. She tried 3 keys before the lock turned. The sound made him lift his head. Sheriff Caleb Boone had grey eyes. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed. Grey, like winter clouds, like the surface of the horse trough, like the belly of a storm. They found her face, drifted to her suitcase visible through the office door, drifted back. Confusion. Then something else, something that looked almost like shame. You weren't meant to see this, he said. His voice was sandpaper, dry, scraped, barely there. Eleanor knelt, her skirt pulled on the dusty floor. She'd never been this close to a man who wasn't family, but the thought barely registered. Her hands moved on their own, finding the edge of his shirt where the dark stain had spread. Who did this? Spree didn't answer. His jaw tightened. She saw his teeth clench. Sheriff Boone, who did this? You need to leave. Each word cost him. Train. Go back. The train isn't leaving until Tuesday. Something flickered across his face. She couldn't name it. Couldn't decide if it was fear or relief, or just the pain pulling him under. The wound was higher than she expected, closer to the collarbone. Not a clean cut. Something ragged, like a twist had happened after the blade went in. She didn't know how she knew that. She only knew. Her fingers were stained red now, and the sheriff's breathing was getting worse. I need to get you up, she said. Onto the cot. He didn't argue. That scared her more than the blood. He was heavy, not fat solid. the way men get from lifting saddles and breaking up fights and hauling drunkards to cells. She got her shoulder under his good arm and pulled. Two's boots dragged, left a dark smear on the floorboards. Men. She laid him down, his head rolled to the side, and his eyes closed. Just for a moment, and she thought no, she wouldn't think it. The office had a basin. She found it on a shelf, found a clean rag folded beside it, found a bucket of water that was only slightly stale. She worked as quickly as her trembling hands allowed, pressing the rag to the wound, watching it bloom red, pressing harder. His eyes opened. "Gray, steady now, Tully," he said. "What?" "Deputy Tully Greer." Eleanor's hands kept working. Her mind caught up a moment later. Deputy. That meant someone who was supposed to help, someone who was supposed to protect, someone who should have been here, standing guard, keeping the sheriff from bleeding out on a cell floor. Where is he? Boone's gaze drifted to the desk, to the wanted poster, to the man with no chin. "Loomis," he said. "Came through this morning. Tully, open the door." The words sat in the air between them. Alana understood them one by one, like assembling a sentence in a language she was still learning. The sheriff's own deputy, the man trusted to watch his back, had unlocked a cell and let a wanted man walk free, and shot his boss on the way out. How long ago? 5 hours, maybe 6. 5 hours, bleeding for 5 hours. Alone, no one checking on him. No one answering the door. Jet, the dust and the cold coffee and the spider weaving its patient web. Eleanor stood. Her knees popped. Her skirt was ruined, soaked through at the hem, but that didn't matter. None of the things she'd worried about on the train would. He like her. Would the town be kind? Would she miss the ocean? None of it mattered now. She walked to the door, locked it, drew the heavy drapes across the window, plunging the office into warm golden dimness, crossed to the gun rack, lifted the shotgun, checked that it was loaded. Boone watched her. His breathing had steadied, but the rag was already dark again. "He knows I'm alone in here," she said, too. It wasn't a question. Boone didn't answer, too. He didn't have to. Eleanor set the shotgun against the desk, within reach. Then she picked up the sheriff's star from where it lay on the Bible. The metal was cool, heavier than she expected. She turned it over. On the back, scratched into the silver in small, careful letters. Sarah, not his name, someone else's. She looked at him. Thea's eyes had closed again, but his hand rested on his chest, fingers spread, as though reaching for something that used to be there. Outside. The autumn light had shifted from amber to gold, to October 19th, 1872. 4:12 in the afternoon. The train was gone. The rails were silent. Eleanor Pierce had arrived 3 weeks early to find a sheriff who never expected her to come at all. She pulled the chair from behind the desk, set it next to the cot, and sat down with the shotgun across her lap. There was nothing she could do about the blood, nothing she could do about the deputy or the man with no chin or the name scratched into the star. But she could sit here, she could wait, she could listen to Caleb Boone breathe, ragged and stubborn, refusing to stop. The spider worked on its web, too. The coffee grew another layer of skin. The man with no chin was out there somewhere. A deputy who'd betrayed his sheriff was probably with him, and a woman who'd crossed a continent to marry. A stranger sat in the gathering dark and watched a wounded man sleep. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know if she'd made a terrible mistake or the only right choice, or something in between. But she knew one thing. She was here now, and she wasn't leaving. Sometimes, Eleanor would learn in the years to come. That's all love is at the beginning. Not romance or certainty or happy endings. Just showing up. Just staying. Just pressing a clean rag to a wound and saying nothing when a man opens his eyes and looks, Jet, at you like you're the first good thing he's seen in a very long time. The key stayed in the lock all night. No one came to take it. The first key didn't fit. Neither did the second. Eleanor's thumb found a splinter in the iron handle and drove it deep, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Not with that sound coming from the cell. That wet, ragged breathing that seemed to catch on something every few seconds. The third key turned. The lock groaned like it hadn't been opened in months. She pushed the door hard enough that it banged against the stone wall thing, and then she was inside, and the sheriff was on his knees, and her thumbnail was bleeding, and she hadn't even noticed. She tasted iron, bit her cheek, swallowed. Caleb Boone's hand gripped the bars, like they were the only thing keeping him upright. His knuckles were white, then yellow, then white again, too. His other hand pressed hard against his ribs and under his fingers. His shirt was black and glistening in the pale light from the rear window. Black, not red. That meant it had been bleeding a long time. Eleanor dropped to her knees. The floor was cold through her skirt. She reached for his shoulder, and he flinched, not away from her, but toward the sound of her voice, like a man who'd been alone in the dark so long he'd forgotten what help felt like. "I need to see it," she said. "I need to see how bad." His jaw tightened, but his hand dropped. She pulled the fabric aside carefully, too carefully. Her fingers were shaking. The wound was higher than she'd thought, closer to the collarbone, a ragged tear that wasn't straight or clean. Whoever had done this had twisted the blade on the way out. She didn't know how. She knew that. She just did. The bleeding had slowed, but not stopped. Every breath pushed a fresh bead of red through the gap in his skin. She looked around. The cell held nothing but a cot with a thin mattress, a bucket in the corner, a Bible on the windowsill. No bandages, no clean water, nothing. Her petticoat had 3 layers. She'd sewn them herself on the train to pass the time between Chicago and Omaha. Tiny, even stitches. Her mother had taught her that good seams don't show. Eleanor tore the bottom layer at the hem and pulled until the fabric gave way. Descend, ripped through the silence like something breaking. Caleb Boone watched her. His gray eyes tracked her hands, the white linen, the way she folded it into a square and pressed it against his shoulder. Two didn't speak. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he'd used up all his words on that first sentence. "You weren't meant to see this. You're burning up," she said. His skin was hot under her palm. Fever heat. For infection heat. The kind of heat that meant a body was fighting a war it might not win. She pressed harder on the wound. His breath hissed through his teeth. Sorry, he shook his head. One small movement. Boot prints crossed the floor from the cell door to the desk and back again. She saw them now. Really saw them, because she was kneeling at their center. His boots, dragging the heel marks where he'd pulled himself forward, 1 inch at a time, trying to reach something. The shotgun. The door, help that never came. And another set. Smaller, narrower toes. A man who wore city shoes, not cowboy boots. A man who'd walked into this cell, stood beside the sheriff, and then walked out again. Tully Greer, deputy. Eleanor looked at the wanted poster on the desk. The man with no chin. Loomis. She didn't know his first name. Didn't want to. He was here, she said. Tully. He was standing right here. Boone's eyes closed. That was answer enough. 5 hours. The sheriffs had been bleeding for 5 hours. And his own deputy had walked past him, stepped over him maybe, and left him here to die. Hadn't even taken the key. Hadn't bothered to lock the cell door behind him. Just walked out into the October afternoon and kept walking. Eleanor's hands were red now. The linen was soaked through. She folded another layer, pressed harder. Who is he? Tully. Young Boone's voice was gravel and glass. 22. Mother runs the dry goods. How long has he worked for you? 8 months. 8 months. Though, long enough to learn the routine. Long enough to know when the sheriff was alone. Long enough to wait for the right moment, the right outlaw, the right price. What's bet? Eleanor heard herself ask the question, but she wasn't sure if she was asking Boone or Tully, or the empty air. Why would he do this? Boone didn't answer. His breathing had changed, shallower, faster. His hand found her wrist, gripped it, not hard. Just enough to let her know he was still there. Loomis, he said, as papers. Territorial pardon. What papers? Stole 'em, Sue, from the governor's courier. If he gets to Cheyenne with those papers, he walks free. Everything he's done, the bank in North Platte, the stagecoach outside the family outside Sydney. Boone's voice broke on the word family. Just barely. Just a crack. All a day. All of it erased. The safe sat in the corner of the office, behind the desk. Big as a hope chest, black iron, combination lock, Eleanor hadn't noticed it before. Now, she couldn't look away. Loomis wants those papers, she said. That's why he came here. Yes, and Tully knew. Tully brought him here. Yes. Her hands kept moving. Press, fold, press. The bleeding was slowing. That was good. That was something. She became aware slowly of the silence. Not quite. No footsteps on the boardwalk. No horses in the street. No voices calling back and forth between shops. Logan Creek had maybe 300 residents, but at 5:22 on a Saturday afternoon, it should have sound. Movement, life. Instead, nothing. The train whistle had faded east 20 minutes ago. Then, the next train wouldn't arrive until Tuesday. 3 days, 72 hours. 72 hours. A man could bleed out, heal up, or ride 100 miles in any direction. No one's coming, Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. Spoon didn't answer it like one. They don't know. Tully sent telegrams. Said, I was in Omaha. Said he was holding the office. She thought of the spider web in the window, the dust on the floor, the cold coffee with its gray skin. No one had been here in days. No one had checked. No one had wondered why the sheriff's store stayed closed, and his horse stayed gone, and his star stayed face down on a Bible. Tully Greer hadn't just shot his boss. He'd erased him, made him invisible, left him to bleed out in a cell where no one would think to look. Eleanor stood. Her skirt clung to her knees, wet and heavy. Her hands were stained to the wrist. She walked to the desk, picked up the sheriff's star, turned it over in her palm. Sarah. She didn't know who Sarah was. Wife. Mother. Someone he'd loved and lost and never stopped reaching for. Someone who'd worn this star before him. Someone who'd scratched her name into silver so he'd never forget. Didn't matter. Not now. She looked at the street door. The glass was dark. The drapes were drawn. Touts. Outside, the man with no chin was walking free. The deputy who'd betrayed his sheriff was probably with him. No one in this town knew that their protector was bleeding to death on a cell cot. Eleanor set the star down. Pit up the shotgun. Checks the load. Then she walked to the street door, turned the lock, and drew the bolt. Caleb Boone watched her from the cell. His face was gray now, the same color as his eyes, but his voice, when he spoke, was steady. What are you doing? Eleanor didn't answer right away. She checked. The back door locked it too. Pulled the drapes closed until no sliver of light showed. Moved the chair from behind the desk and set it beside the cot. Then she sat down, the shotgun across her lap, and met his gaze. He knows I'm alone in here, she said. Tully, he saw me come in. He knows. The train left. Who knows? There's no one coming. She didn't say the rest. She didn't have to. Tully Greer had left his sheriff to die. Slow. What would he do to a woman who'd found him? Scrit. What would he do to protect his secret, his freedom, his second chance? Boone's hand found hers. His fingers were cold now. Fever. Heat was breaking. Eleanor. Her name. He'd never said it before. Not in the letters. Not when she arrived. Not once in all the hours since. Just this. I'm not leaving, she said. His grip tightened. Just barely. Just enough. Outside, the autumn light was fading. October 19th, 1872. 5:47 in the evening. Spider worked on its web. The coffee grew another layer of skin. A woman who'd crossed a continent to marry a stranger sat in a locked office with a shotgun on her lap and a wounded man's hand in hers. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know if Tully Greer would come back or if Loomis would come with him, or if the sheriff beside her would live to see the morning. But she knew one thing. She wasn't the same woman who'd stepped off that train. That woman had believed in letters and promises and happy endings. That woman had thought love was something you waited for, something you received, something you found already made. That woman was gone now. In her place sat someone new, someone who'd tasted iron and felt a stranger's blood warm on her hands, someone who'd locked a door and made a choice and didn't know if it was the right one, but knew, deep in her bones, that it was hers to make. Sometimes, that's how we find out who we really are. Not in the quiet moments, the peaceful ones, the days when everything goes according to plan. We find out in the cells and the locked rooms and the fading light. We find out when the train leaves and we choose to stay. Eleanor Pierce stayed. And somewhere out in the gathering dark, a man with city shoes and a guilty conscience was about to learn that the woman he'd left behind wasn't afraid of him at all. The lamp burned low, and Eleanor watched the shadow of the flame dance across the ceiling. She'd lost track of how many times she'd changed the bandage, how many times she'd dipped the rag in clean water, wrung it out, pressed it to his shoulder, how many times she'd checked his breathing, his pulse, the color of his skin. Midnight came and went, then 1 o'clock, then 2. Caleb Boone lay on the cot with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling boards like he could see through them. Light. He was looking at something far away, something that had happened long ago, something he'd never quite stopped looking at even years later. The rag in the basin made a sound. Tick, tick, tick. Blood dripping into water. Rhythms like a clock that had forgotten how to measure hours. Eleanor wrung it out, pressed it to his shoulder, didn't flinch, didn't seem to notice. Sarah, the name was burned into her mind now. She could see it every time she closed her eyes. The scratched letters, uneven, patient. Someone had taken time with that. Someone had wanted it to last. She picked up the star from the desk, turned it over, scran, her thumb across the grooves. Who was she? Spee. Her voice was quiet, barely above a whisper. She didn't expect him to answer. But he did. My wife. The words came slow. Each one pulled from somewhere deep, somewhere he'd locked away and thought he'd never have to visit again. 2 years. 2 years in November. Eleanor set the star down. She didn't know what to say, didn't know if there was anything to say. What words could possibly fit between a man and the woman he'd buried? What happened? Fever. His eyes didn't move from the ceiling. Came through in October, took her in 3 days. The baby, too. The baby. Sarah had been carrying a child, his child. A life he'd never meet. A future that had ended before it began. Eleanor's hand found the edge of the cot. Tell Don. I'm sorry, she whispered. He didn't respond, didn't nod, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge that she'd spoken at all. Ole. He just kept staring at those ceiling boards, at whatever ghosts he saw moving between them. The silence stretched, filled the room, became its own presence. And then Eleanor thought of something that had been sitting at the edge of her mind since she first saw that star, since she first read his name on the agency papers, since she first stepped off that train and found a town that didn't know its sheriff was dying. The letters, but 2 letters, brief and polite, that had crossed the continent from Nebraska to Pennsylvania. She'd read them so many times, the paper had grown soft at the folds. Memorized every line. Asterisk, I have secured a house near the Mercantile. The town is quiet but honest. I look forward to your arrival. Asterisk, not once, nor a single word, about Sarah, about the wife he'd buried, about the child who'd never drawn breath. He hadn't told her she'd come 3,000 miles to marry a man who'd never mentioned his own wife existed. The thought sat in her chest, colon heavy. She tried to push it away. He was grieving. He was wounded. He was barely holding on. This wasn't the time. This wasn't the place. But the thought wouldn't leave. It grew roots, spread branches, filled every corner of her mind until she couldn't think of anything else. The photographed her valise sat by the door, exactly where she'd left it when she first walked in. She crossed to it, knelt, unbuckled the straps. Her hands were steady now, no more shaking, no more trembling. Inside, beneath her spare dress and her mother's Bible and the tin of biscuits her sister had packed, was the photograph, the one the agency had sent to, the one she'd shown everyone who asked why a young woman would travel alone to Nebraska territory. She pulled it out, held it to the lamplight. A man in a sheriff's star, unsure smile, stiff posture. The photographer's backdrop showed mountains that didn't exist within 500 miles of Logan Creek. She'd memorized this face too. The curve of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead, a small scar above his left eyebrow. But now, looking at it, really looking, she saw what she'd missed before. The collar was wrong. The shirt in this photograph had buttons of dark wood. The shirt Boone wore now had white bone buttons. The star in the photograph was pinned at a slight angle, left side higher than right. Boone's star, when she'd found it on the desk, had been perfectly straight. And the eyes were wrong. This man had kind eyes, gentle eyes that looked like they'd never watched a fever take everything they loved. Caleb Boone's eyes were grey as winter, storms and just as cold. Eleanor looked at the man on the cot, looked at the photograph in her hands, looked back at the man. This isn't you. Her voice was flat, not a question, not an accusation, just a fact, settling into the space between them. Boone's eyes finally moved from the ceiling, found hers. Hell no, he said. It's not. The words hung in the air, heavy, irreversible. Who is he? My brother. Samuel. He was sheriff before me. Was bandits 2 years ago March. He stepped in front of a bullet meant for a bank teller's son. Eleanor looked at the photograph again. The kind eyes, the gentle smile. A man who died saving a child. A man whose face had been sent to a woman 3,000 miles away, promising a future he'd never live to see. The agency, she said, thought you were him. Yes, you didn't correct them. No, she waited for an explanation, for an apology, for anything that would make sense of this, make it bearable, make it less than the betrayal it was. He didn't speak. Maybe he had no words left. He'd used them all up on Sarah and Samuel, and the baby who never breathed. Maybe he'd spent 2 years going through the motions, running an office that wasn't his, wearing a star that belonged to his dead brother, venturing to a name that fit like borrowed shoes. And when the agency letter arrived addressed to Sheriff Samuel Boone, requesting his interest in a bride, he hadn't written back to explain. Hunt told them Samuel was gone. Hadn't told them Caleb existed at all. He'd just replied, signed his brother's name, sent his brother's photograph, promise his brother's future. Eleanor set the photograph down. Her hands were shaking again. I came here, she said slowly, because I thought someone wanted me. Her voice cracked on the last word. She swallowed, steadied it. My mother died in April. My father remarried in June. His new wife had 3 daughters of her own. The house was too small, and I was 24 years old. No one in Meadville, Pennsylvania, was going to marry a woman with no dowry and no prospects and no family to speak for her. She wasn't looking at him now. She was looking at her hands, red-stained and raw, folded in her lap. The agency said there was a sheriff in Nebraska who'd paid the fee in full. A good man. Honest man, a man who wrote 2 letters in careful handwriting and promised to meet my train. She looked up. That man never existed. Boone's face didn't change, but his hand, the one resting on his chest, curled into a fist. No, he said. I didn't. Eleanor stood, walked to the window, pulls the drape aside just enough to see the street. Empty. Dark, silent. She could leave. The livery was 2 blocks east. She had money enough for a horse, or at least for a stall until Tuesday. She could wait for the train, go back to Omaha, explain to the agency that there'd been a mistake. They'd find her another match, another town, slads, another man who might or might not be who he claimed to be. She could leave. She should leave. Behind her, Boone's breathing had changed. Shallower, faster. The fever was returning. She'd let the rag sit too long in the basin, let the water grow cold, let herself forget what she was supposed to be doing. But she wasn't his nurse, wasn't his wife, wasn't anything to him except a woman who'd answered a letter never meant for her. Eleanor turned from the window. Caleb Boone was watching her, grey eyes, steady now, waiting, not pleading, not hoping, not asking for anything, just waiting, the way a man waits for a verdict he already knows. I came here to be needed, she said. Her voice was quiet, not angry, not bitter, just true. My whole life I've been extra. Extra daughter, extra woman, extra mouth to feed. A holiday. Always on the edge of things, never at the center. My mother loved me, but she died. My father loves me, but he has a new family now. I thought if I came here, I could be someone's first choice, someone's priority, someone's reason. She picked up the photograph. Samuel's kind face. Samuel's gentle smile. But you didn't choose me. Choose a letter. A photograph. A woman you'd never met, who could be anyone, look like anything, be whatever you needed her to be. Didn't want Eleanor Pierce from Meadville, Pennsylvania. He wanted a wife. Any wife. A warm body in the house that's too quiet now. A voice at the table that isn't an echo. Someone to fill the space Sarah left behind. The words hung in the air. Brutal. True. Boone didn't deny them. Didn't defend himself. Didn't speak at all. Eleanor set the photograph down, picked up the rag from the basin, wrung it out, crossed to the cot, and pressed it against his shoulder. He flinched, not from the pain, from her touch. I should go, she said, should walk out that door and never look back. Her hand stayed where it was, pressing the rag, holding steady. But you'll die if I do. Not tonight. Maybe not tomorrow. The fever will come back, and the bleeding will start again. And no one in this town knows you're here, and Tully Greer isn't coming to save you. She met his eyes. So I'm staying. Not because you deserve it, not because I forgive you, not because any of this is fair or right, or what I came here for. She pressed harder on the wound. I'm staying because I'm not the kind of woman who watches a man die alone. Boone's fist uncurled, his fingers found the edge of her sleeve. Held Eleanor. His voice was barely a whisper. I know. She didn't ask what he knew, didn't need to. The word held everything. The weight of his silence, the depth of his shame, the shape of the truth he'd been too afraid to speak. Outside. The first grey light of dawn touched the horizon. I saw October 20th, 1872. 5:17 in the morning. And then Eleanor realized the photograph in her valise, the one he supposedly sent, the one she'd carried across 3,000 miles, the one she'd pressed to her chest every night on the train, was a lie. Dawn came slow to Logan Creek, slipping under the drapes in thin grey ribbons. Slimmer. Eleanor watched them stretch across the floor, inch by inch, until they touched the toes of her boots. She hadn't slept, hadn't tried. Caleb Boone had finally closed his eyes around 4 in the morning, not sleep, more like surrender, whose body had simply given up on staying awake. Pierce. Breathing was shallow but steady, her skin still too warm, but the bleeding had stopped, and that was something. That was hope. Eleanor sat in the chair beside the cot and tried to think. Not about the photograph, not about the lies, not about the wife he'd buried and the brother he'd replaced, and the child who'd never drawn breath. That was a wound too deep to touch right now, and she had work to do. Tully Greer, 22 years old, mother, ran the dry goods. Tad worked for Sheriff Boone for 8 months, had unlocked a cell door and let a killer walk free, had shot his boss in the shoulder and left him to bleed out on the floor. And he knew Eleanor was here. She'd walked through town yesterday afternoon, asking questions. A woman with a calfskin suitcase and Eastern clothes and no husband at her side. She'd stood on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office for a full minute before going in. Tully could have been anywhere, swatting from the livery, peeking through the mercantile window, sitting in the saloon across the street with a glass of whiskey and a guilty conscience. He knew she was here. He knew the train had left. He knew his sheriff was alone and wounded and helpless, and he hadn't come back. That meant something. Either he was scared, or he was waiting. Or he was planning something bigger than a single act of betrayal. Eleanor looked at the shotgun leaning against the desk, then at her own hands, red and raw, folded in her lap. She'd never fired a gun in her life. The clock on the wall read 7:15. Outside, the first sounds of a town waking up, a door opening, a horse stamping, a man's voice calling a greeting to someone down the street. Normal sounds, the sounds of a Saturday morning in October, when no one knew their sheriff was dying. And no one suspected their deputy was a traitor. No one had any idea that a woman from Pennsylvania was sitting in a locked office with a shotgun she didn't know how to use. Eleanor stood, her knees cracked, skirt was stiff with dried blood. She looked at Boone. Still asleep, still breathing, still alive. Then she walked to the door, unlocked it, and stepped out into the morning. The air hit her first, cold and clean and smelling of wood smoke and horses. She'd forgotten what fresh air felt like. 17 hours in that office, breathing dust and blood and lamplight. 17 hours of watching a stranger sleep. Logan Creek's Main Street ran east to west. Maybe 200 yards of boardwalk and hitching posts and storefronts painted faded colors. The Mercantile sat at the corner, its windows displaying bolts of fabric and cans of peaches. And a wooden sign that read Greer's 3 Holiday. In careful block letters, Eleanor walked toward. Her boots made sound on the boards. Steady, measured, each step a decision. Each step a promise she hadn't quite named yet. The bell above the Mercantile door chimed when she entered. Inside, it smelt of coffee beans and leather and cinnamon. Barrels of nails sat beside sacks of flour. Split glass cases displayed ribbons and buttons and pocket watches. A woman stood behind the counter, sorting invoices. 50 years old, maybe. Spray streaking her brown hair. Narrow shoulders. Careful hands. Mrs. Greer. She looked up. When Eleanor entered, smiled. The automatic smile of a shopkeeper greeting a customer. Morning. Something I can help you with. Lena's heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her palms were damp. Her voice, when she found it, sounded almost normal. I'm looking for ribbon. Mrs. Greer set down her invoices, wiped her hands on her apron. What color? Blue. Light blue. For a dress. The woman nodded, turned to the glass case, began pulling out spools. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency. She'd done this thousands of times. Eleanor looked around the store, shelves stacked high with goods. Back room, door slightly ajar. A coat hanging on a hook by the counter. Men's coat. Dark wool, mutt on the hem. City shoes. Beneath it, narrow toes. This is a pretty shade, Mrs. Greer said, holding up a spool. Matches your eyes. Eleanor looked at the ribbon. Blue. Light blue, the color of a winter sky. It's perfect, she said. It'll take 2 yards. Mrs. Greer measured and cut, wrapped the ribbon in brown paper, named a price. Eleanor counted coins into her palm. And then, as she tucked the package into her pocket, she asked the question she'd come here to ask. Is your son here, Tully? The woman's hands paused, just for a second, just long enough. He's out, won't be back till evening. Oh. Eleanor kept her voice light. Casual. I met him yesterday. Seemed like a nice young man. Mrs. Greer smiled. Birth. Her eyes had changed, grown. Careful. He's a good boy, she said. Works hard, helps his mother. I'm sure he does. Eleanor picked up her package, nodded her thanks, walked to the door. Her hand was on the handle when Mrs. Greer spoke again. You're the woman from the train, though. The one looking for the sheriff. Eleanor turned. A pause. The shopkeeper's face was unreadable. Sheriff Boone is a lucky man. Eleanor didn't answer. She walked out into the cold October morning, the bell chiming behind her, the blue ribbon wrapped in brown, paper burning a hole in her pocket. She knew what she needed to know. Tully Greer wasn't hiding. He wasn't running. He was waiting for sunset, when he'd meet Loomis at the creek bridge and help him escape with the pardon papers. His mother knew something, not everything, maybe, but enough to be afraid, enough to ask questions she didn't want answered. And Eleanor had less than 9 hours back in the office. Boone was awake. His eyes found her the moment she walked through the door, gray and steady in watching. Where did you go? Shopping. She set the brown paper package on the desk and wrapped the ribbon letter unspool across the wood. A river of blue between the wanted poster and the dented tin cup. Boone looked at it. Then, at her Tully's meeting Loomis at the creek bridge at sunset, Eleanor said, his mother didn't say it. Basheen didn't have to. Boone tried to sit up. His face went white. His hand flew to his shoulder. You can't, Eleanor said. You'll tear the stitches. I have to. Each word cost him. He's my deputy, my responsibility. He's your killer, and he'll finish the job if you walk out there bleeding and half dead. Boone's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue, couldn't. They both knew she was right. Eleanor picked up the shotgun, weighed it in her hands. Show me how to use this. He looked at her, really looked, not at The blood on her skirt or the shadows under her eyes or the blue ribbon still unfurled across his desk at her. At Eleanor Pierce from Meadville, Pennsylvania, who'd crossed a continent to marry a man who didn't exist. You don't have to do this, he said. I know. It's not your fight. I know. Tully. Won't hesitate. Loomis. Won't hesitate. 2. If you go out there with that gun, you have to be ready to use it. Eleanor met his gaze. Didn't look away. Then show me how. He did. It took an hour. His voice was weak. His instructions interrupted by pauses to breathe, to swallow, to wait for the pain to ebb. Bed. His hands were steady when he touched hers, adjusting her grip, lowering the stock against her shoulder. Don't aim for the body, he said. Aim for the center of the chest. Will hit something that matters. She practiced raising the gun, sight along the barrel, steady her breathing. The shoulder would be bruised tomorrow. She didn't care. At 4:30, she changed his bandage one last time. His skin was cooler. The fever was breaking. He was going to live. At 4:44. She loaded the shotgun with fresh shells from the desk drawer. At 4:52, Boone stood. He swayed, scored himself on the cot frame. His face was gray, and his good hand trembled against the iron. But he stood. You load, Eleanor said. He didn't argue, didn't tell her to stay, didn't thank her. He just picked up the box of shells, slipped it into his coat pocket, and nodded. The walk to the creek bridge took 7 minutes. Splitter. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Shadows stretched long across the grass. The creek whispered over stones, cold and clear. Eleanor's heart beat steady now. Her hands didn't shake. She thought about her mother, who'd taught her to sew tiny, even stitches. She thought about her father, who'd looked at her with love and relief when she announced she was moving west. She thought about the train, the endless rails, too. The photograph of a man with kind eyes who'd died saving a child. She thought about Sarah, buried 2 years in November, and the child who never breathed, and the grimed man walking beside her with his hand pressed to his wounded shoulder. And his jaw set hard. She thought about the blue ribbon, still lying on the desk. She'd meant to put it in her valise, hadn't had time. Maybe later, maybe. After the bridge appeared through the cottonwoods, wooden planks, iron rails, a single span across the narrowest part of the creek. A man stood at the far end, his back to them. No chin, just a slope from lip to neck. Loomis. Another man waited at the near end. Younger, narrow shoulders, city shoes. Tully Greer turned when he heard their footsteps. His face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Surprise, fear, and something else. Something that looked almost like relief. Sheriff, he said, should be dead. Disappointed. Tully didn't answer. Sighs. Moved to Eleanor, to the shotgun in her hands. You don't want to do this, ma'am. You don't know what I want. She stepped onto the bridge. The planks creaked under her boots. Loomis turned at the sound, his face shifting from waiting to wary. Eleanor raised the shotgun, sighted along the barrel, steadied her breathing. Loomis's eyes found hers, not Boone's, hers. And in that moment, everything she'd been, the extra daughter. The forgotten woman, the bride who'd traveled 3,000 miles to marry a life away. It burned off like morning fog under a strong sun.